Part 1. The Key. The mountains do not care about the calendar. They never have. In the fall of 1873, in the western reaches of Virginia, where the Appalachian ridges fold over one another like the hands of an old man who has seen too much and forgiven too little, the wind came down from the north 3 weeks before it had any business doing so. It carried in it something that the almanac had not predicted, and the minister had not prayed for, and the town of Caldwell Hollow was not prepared to receive. It carried the truth. The truth was simple. The winter was coming early. It was going to be deep and long and merciless. And the only 2 people in that town who knew it were 17 years old, motherless, fatherless, and about to be thrown out into it with nothing but a flour sack, 2 books and a key that opened a door nobody else wanted. Their names were Clara and Grace Ashwood, and this is their story. But first, you need to understand the town. Caldwell Hollow sat in a crease between 2 ridges the way a coin sits in the fold of an old coat. It had been there since before the Revolution. It had survived the Revolution, the fever years, the drought of 1845, and the war that had torn the country in half between 1861 and 1865. It had survived all of those things, but it had not healed from the last one. 8 years after Appomattox, the men of Caldwell Hollow still sat on opposite sides of the church. The ones who had worn blue sat on the left. The ones who had worn gray sat on the right. And the ones who had lost sons and brothers and fathers on both sides sat in the middle and stared at the floor and tried to remember what it had felt like to live in a world where the man across the aisle was just your neighbor. The town had a general store run by a man named Warren Pruitt, 60 years old, with a face like weathered hickory bark and hands that had not been steady since the winter of 1864. It had a foundling home run by a woman named Agnes Holt, 55 years old, with gray hair pulled so tight against her skull that the skin at her temples shone like old linen. It had a church presided over by a man named Reverend Edmund Voss, 48 years old, who had come down from a seminary in Philadelphia in 1869 and had never quite recovered from the discovery that the people he had come to shepherd were not the gentle flock his education had prepared him for. They were harder than that, quieter than that, and far more dangerous in their silence than anything he had encountered in any book. And it had the Ashwood twins. Clara was the older by 4 minutes. She had her father's eyes dark and steady and always measuring something the rest of the room had not yet thought to measure. She kept a ledger, not a diary, a ledger. In it she recorded the date the geese flew south, the depth of the first frost, the behavior of the squirrels in August, the direction the wind shifted in the first week of September. She had been keeping this ledger since she was 11 years old, the year her father pressed it into her hands 3 weeks before he died, and told her, "Write down what you see, Clara, not what you are told, what you see." Grace was quieter than her sister, in the way that deep water is quieter than a fast creek. She did not keep a ledger. She kept something harder to name. She listened. To the wind, yes, but also to the silences between the wind. She had been having the same dream every night for 6 years since the night their father died. And in the dream she never saw him. She only heard his voice. It said the same thing every time. "Keep going, my girl." She had never told anyone about the dream. not even Clara. She had been saving it for the moment it would mean something. She was almost out of time. Their father had been a man named Elias Ashwood, Union scout. Not an officer. Not a man who gave orders from behind a hill. A man who walked 10 miles ahead of the army in the dark and came back with the news of where the enemy slept and how many fires they had burning, and whether the creek crossing to the south would hold a column of infantry in the rain. He had served under Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley campaign, and he had come home in 1865 to a wife named Mary and 2 small daughters who he loved. With the particular ferocity of a man who has spent 4 years learning exactly how easily the people you love can be taken from you. He did not talk about the war. He talked about the weather. He took Clara and Grace out to the creek behind their cabin in the summer. They turned 8 after a heavy rain, and he showed them how to mark the rise of the water with a notch cut into a smooth gray stone. He showed them how the geese flew, and how the squirrels stored, and how the high clouds moved against the low clouds when a true storm was building. He gave Clara the ledger. He told her the earth does not lie. Only men lie about the earth. Mary Ashwood died of typhoid in the summer of 1867. Elias followed her 3 weeks later of the same fever, or perhaps of something that had no name in the medical books, but that anyone who had ever truly loved another person would have recognized immediately. On his last night with Clara and Grace sitting on either side of his bed, he pressed a rusted iron key into Grace's hand and told them, "Go west when the world drives you out. 2 days. There is a place I hid for you a long time ago. I am sorry I cannot stay to show you, but I have left enough." He died before dawn. They were 11 years old. Agnes Holt took them in. Or rather, Agnes Holt's foundling home took them in, which was not quite the same thing. Agnes ran the home the way a general runs a campaign, with efficiency and without sentiment. And she had been doing it since 1856. She was not cruel in the way that people think of cruelty with raised voices and visible anger. She was cruel in the way of cold weather, constant and impersonal, and indifferent to the effect it had on the people it touched. She fed the children. She clothed them. She kept the roof sound and the woodpile stocked and the fever down when the fever came. And she maintained in that building a rule so absolute and so unspoken that it did not need to be written anywhere. You did not question the almanac. You did not write your own observations in your own book. You did not look at the sky and tell the sky it was wrong. For 6 years, Clara had walked the edge of that rule the way a person walks the edge of a riverbank in high water. Close enough to feel the pull, never quite falling in. In the summer of 1873, the pull got stronger. The squirrels were frantic. Clara noted it in her ledger in early August, frantic and hoarding with a desperation she had not seen in the 4 years she had been watching them. The mountain ash berries were thicker than anyone in the hollow could remember, heavy clusters of orange-red bowing the branches down toward the ground. The geese were restless 2 weeks before they usually stirred, and the wind, when it came from the north in the first week of September, had a bite in it that the almanac said would not arrive until October. Clara wrote it all down. She wrote the date and the temperature and the behavior, and then at the bottom of the page, in her father's careful, slanted style, she wrote her conclusion. The winter will come a month early and end a month late. The snow will be deep enough to close the road from the east, We will need double the flour, double the firewood, double everything. She showed it to no one. Not yet. The confrontation with Reverend Voss happened on a Tuesday in the second week of September. Clara was at the creek bank below the Foundling home, kneeling in the mud, with her dress wet to the knees, marking the water level on a smooth gray stone, the way her father had shown her. The creek had been rising faster than the rain accounted for, which meant the ground higher up the ridge was already saturated, which meant something about the water table that she had not yet fully worked out but intended to. She heard him on the path above before she saw him, the sound of good leather boots on dry ground, then 3 sets of lighter footsteps behind. She did not look up. Reverend Voss stopped on the path and looked down at her. He had with him 3 women from his congregation: Mabel Finch, the seamstress; Dorothea Greer, whose husband had lost an arm at Chancellorsville and never worked again; and young Patience Ault, who was 19 and newly married and still trying to understand what kind of town she had married into. All 3 of them stopped when the Reverend stopped with the instinctive deference of people who have decided that someone else's judgment is easier than their own. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the girl in the mud and the stone and the small, careful mark she was cutting into it. And something moved across his face that was not quite contempt and not quite fear. It was closer to recognition, the recognition of a man who has been taught that there is one correct way to read the world, encountering someone who is reading it a different way entirely. Then he spoke. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. A woman's place, he said, is to trust the almanac of God, not to make scribbles in her own little book. Clara finished the mark, set the pencil in her pocket. Then she looked up at him with eyes the color of cold creek water, and she said, "Reverend, the crows flew south 4 weeks early this year. My father said he had only seen that twice in his life. The first time was 1857. The second time was 1861. The Reverend went very still. He had not been in Caldwell Hollow in 1861. He had been in Philadelphia in a seminary learning the proper construction of Sunday sermons. But he knew what 1861 meant. Everyone in that town knew what 1861 meant. It was the year the men had walked out of their houses with their rifles and their flags and their particular certainties about who was right and who was wrong. And the town had cracked down the middle. And it had never in 8 years put itself entirely back together. Clara had not been alive in 1861. She had not been alive in 1857. But she had spoken of those years the way a doctor speaks of an illness she has treated before, with the flat, calm certainty of someone who has seen the evidence and drawn the conclusion, and does not particularly care whether you agree with her. The 3 women behind the Reverend did not laugh. They looked at the girl in the wet dress on the creek bank, and then they looked away. Voss did not answer her. He turned and walked back up the path. And from that morning forward, he carried in his chest a quiet and patient hatred for Clara Ashwood that would not reach its full expression for weeks when he stood at the front of his congregation and called her a false prophet and a danger to the faithful. He had time to wait. He believed he had all winter. He was wrong about that, too. 3 days after the confrontation at the creek, Agnes Holt sent Clara to Warren Pruitt's general store with the Foundling Homes credit book to buy a 50-pound sack of flour The home had 23 children that summer, and the bread had been running thin since August. Clara walked the half-mile into town, in the dust of the road, carrying the credit book under her arm. And she went into the store and set the book on the counter and asked for the flour. Warren Pruitt looked at the book. He looked at the girl. He was 60 years old, with a face that had been weathered by more than weather, and hands that had learned to be steady again after many years of deliberate effort. He had a younger brother named Henry, who had been killed at Petersburg in the summer of 1864 by a Union sharpshooter killed in a trench so deep that Henry's body had never been recovered. Warren had never spoken of his brother to a living soul. He thought about him every single day. He looked at Clara Ashwood and he thought about her father, Elias Ashwood, Union scout, the kind of man whose work in the Shenandoah Valley had killed men in gray from the safety of the dark. The kind of man who had never had to look his enemy in the face. Warren told himself, though somewhere in a quieter part of himself he knew that was not quite right, that scouts saw the enemy face to face more closely than anyone, that the dark was not safety, but only a different kind of danger. He did not attend to the quieter part of himself. He said your father was a Yankee spy. He was a traitor to this state. You think I'm going to sell flour to the daughter of a man like that? Clara did not flinch. She had been waiting for some version of this conversation for most of her conscious life. She looked at him steadily and said, Mr. Pruitt, there are 23 children in that home. If you do not sell us the flour, some of them will not survive the winter. Who my father was does not change that. Warren Pruitt felt his face go hot. He told her to get out of his store. She got out. She walked back to the foundling home in the afternoon heat, and she did not cry. She had learned at 11 that crying was a luxury the body could not always afford a waste of salt and water. But she understood something walking back that she had not fully understood before. The town was not punishing her for the ledger. It was not punishing her for the predictions. It was punishing her for being the daughter of Elias Ashwood, and it had been waiting 8 years for an excuse to finish what the war had started. That evening, she sat on the narrow bed she shared with Grace in the small room at the top of the foundling home, and she wrote in her ledger, "They will not give us what we need to survive the winter. They never intended to. The question is not whether the winter is coming. The question is whether we will be inside or outside when it arrives." She closed the ledger. She looked at her sister across the room. Grace was sitting very still with the rusted iron key in her lap, turning it between her fingers the way she always did when she was thinking about their father. She had carried that key every day for 6 years. It had worn a faint groove in the skin of her right palm. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing yet to say. The boy came on the last night. His name was Tobias Fenn. He was 12 years old with a stutter that got worse under pressure, and a limp from a bone that had been broken and badly set when he was 7. His father had been a private in a Virginia infantry regiment and had died at Gettysburg on the 3rd day of July in 1863, killed by a bullet that did not care which side had right on its side. His mother had died 2 winters later of a grief that the doctor called pneumonia, but that Tobias, even at 7, had understood was something closer to the decision to stop. He had been in the foundling home since he was 5. He had one possession that mattered, a folding knife his father had sent home in a letter from camp. in the spring of 1863, 2 months before he died. The blade was 4 inches long, and the handle was bone, and there was a small brass rivet on one end that caught the light when you opened it. On the night before Agnes Holt told the Ashwood twins to be gone by morning, Tobias came down the back stairs of the foundling home in his bare feet, with a candle stub in one hand and the folding knife in the other. He came to the room at the top of the stairs, and he knocked so softly that only someone who was already awake would have heard it. Clara opened the door. He held out the knife. He said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I do not have anything else. But if they make you go, take this." Clara looked at the knife and then at the boy, and then she thought about his father dying on a hillside in Pennsylvania for a cause that was somebody's but perhaps not his. And she thought about her own father dying in his own bed for a fever that was nobody's fault at all. And she closed Tobias's small fingers around the knife and said, "You keep it. You will need it more than we will." He stood there in the doorway in the dark, holding the candle and the knife, and what Clara recognized as the particular grief of a child who has been told he matters by someone who is leaving. Grace, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed, stood up. She walked to where Tobias was standing. She put her hand briefly on the top of his head. It was the kind of touch a mother gives a child. Neither of them had had a mother in 6 years, and neither of them said anything about that. And the touch lasted a moment and a half. And then Tobias went back down the hallway to his room. Agnes caught him on the stairs. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Clara heard it through the floorboards, the sound of an open hand striking the side of a 12-year-old boy's head. 3 times hard enough that the third time she heard something wet. She heard Agnes's voice, low and controlled. "I told you to stay away from those girls." Clara did not move. She lay in the dark and understood something she had known for a while, but had not been willing to name. If she and Grace stayed in this building one more day, Tobias Fenn would not survive their presence. The beatings would get worse. Agnes would find other ways. Clara had seen it before with other children who had gotten too close to the two of them, who had listened too carefully to the things Clara said about the weather, who had shown too much interest in the ledger. She could not protect him from inside the building. She could only protect him by leaving. In the morning, she went down to Agnes Holt's office. She laid the ledger on the desk. She stood. She did not sit. Agnes was behind the desk with her hands folded on the surface of it, in the way she always folded them, precisely deliberately, like a woman who has decided that her hands will not betray anything her face has decided to hide. Clara said, "Mrs. Holt, the winter is going to come a month early. The road from the east will close by December. You need to double the flour and double the firewood before then. If you do not, the children will be in danger." Agnes did not look at the ledger. She did not touch it. She looked at Clara with an expression that had been a long time building the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a particular moment and has now arrived at it. She said, "You poisoned the boy with your fear. You teach the smaller ones to doubt the almanac. You write your scribbles. You measure the creek. I have allowed it because of your mother, who was a good woman, and your father, who was a brave man, however misguided. I will not allow it any longer. By tomorrow morning, you and your sister will be gone." Clara picked up the ledger. She turned toward the door. Then she stopped. She turned back. She said, "Mrs. Holt, why do you keep my father's medal in your apron pocket?" The color went out of Agnes Holt's face the way color goes out of wood when it gets wet. Her hand moved just barely toward the left pocket of her apron. She stopped it. She said nothing. She could not say anything because there was no answer she could give that would not open a door she had spent years keeping shut. Clara waited 3 counts. Then she said quietly, "I know it is there. I have known it for a year. I'm not asking for it back. I am asking why." Agnes stood up. Her chair scraped the floor. Her voice, when it came, was controlled and flat by tomorrow morning. "The Lord provides for the truthful." Clara left the office. She went upstairs. She began to pack, but just before she closed the door behind her, Agnes said one more thing. She said it quietly, almost to herself, in a voice so low that Clara was never entirely sure afterward whether the words had been meant for her at all. She said, "There are some things women should not know. My mother died because she knew too much." Clara did not understand the sentence. She stored it in the place where she stored all the things she did not yet understand, in the quiet back room of herself, where her father's lessons lived and waited until the moment they were needed. She went upstairs and she helped Grace pack. And in the early morning of a September day in 1873, 2 17-year-old girls walked out of the Foundling home and into a wind that did not care how old they were. Agnes Holt stood in the doorway. She did not raise her voice. She said, "The Lord provides for the truthful. The rest find what they deserve." Clara saw the medal, the small bronze disc on a tarnished ribbon half hidden in the pocket of the apron. She saw it and she said nothing. There would be a time. The girl who had survived 6 years in that building knew that the time was never the time you wanted. The townspeople watched from behind curtains as the Ashwood twins walked down the main road of Caldwell Hollow. Old men who had left their arms at Chancellorsville, widows whose husbands had been buried where they fell, Warren Pruitt standing behind the glass of his store window, with his hands in his pockets, and his brother's face somewhere in the back of his mind, where he did not allow himself to look directly at it. They watched and they said nothing because everyone in Caldwell Hollow had agreed in the wordless collective way that towns agree on things, that something had been wrong with those girls for a long time, and the wrongness was finally being resolved. The twins did not look back. They walked west. The road climbed quickly into the hardwoods, and by midday, the rooftops of Caldwell Hollow were gone behind them, swallowed by the ridge. By afternoon, they were in the high country where the wind had nothing to stop it and did not bother to pretend it meant them well. They walked until dusk and found a sheltered place in the lee of a rock outcropping, where 2 large stones made a rough triangle against the hillside. They spread the wool shawl and pressed close together, and ate half the stale bread and said very little. The cold came down after dark like something that had been waiting all summer for permission. Clara lay in the dark and thought about Tobias Fenn lying on a corn husk mattress in the Foundling home, with his ear still hurting and his knife in his pocket, and the smaller children crying around him. She thought about double flour and double firewood. She thought about the creek mark on the gray stone and whether anyone would look at it before the spring. Then Grace spoke, and what she said changed the temperature of the air between them in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She said, "I dream about him every night, Clara. Father, I have dreamt about him every night since he died. I never see him. I only hear his voice. He always says the same thing. He says, 'Keep going, my girl.' He says it over and over." She paused. Her breath made a small cloud in the dark. She said, "I did not understand what he meant. I thought he was just saying something a dying man says. But tonight I understand. He has been telling me all these years that one day this would happen. He knew. He knew. And he prepared something. The key is not nothing, Clara. It was never nothing." Clara held her sister tighter, and the cold pressed in from all sides, and somewhere above them on the ridge, a tree cracked in the wind with a sound like a rifle shot, and neither of them moved. In the morning, they kept walking. The second day, the hunger became physical in a way that the first day had only suggested. Not a dull ache, but a sharp, twisting insistence that took up residence behind the navel and did not leave. Their boots were not made for this kind of walking, and Clara could feel the blisters forming on both heels by mid-morning small burning points that sharpened with every step on the rocky path. She did not mention them. They drank from a creek that ran black and cold through a draw of hemlocks. The water hurt going down and then settled and felt like the most necessary thing in the world. In the middle of the afternoon, they came around a bend in the trail and Grace stopped walking. Clara looked. A wolf stood at the edge of the trees, perhaps 40 yards off. Alone. It was lean in the way that late-season wolves get, lean, the ribs showing as faint ridges under the gray coat when it breathed. Its tongue moved once over its teeth. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply stood and looked at them with the steady, unhurried attention of an animal that has been hungry for long enough, that fear has become a luxury it can no longer afford. A lone wolf in September, this close to a trail in daylight. Clara understood what it meant. The deer were already moving down out of the high country ahead of schedule. The winter was not coming. The winter had already begun up here where the almanac did not reach. She took the small hatchet from her belt. She did not raise it to strike. She raised it so the wolf could see the head of it, the iron face of it, and then she brought the blade down against a flat stone at her feet in a deliberate rhythm. 3 short strikes, 1 long. She paused. 3 short, 1 long. The wolf's ears went flat against its skull. She did it a 3rd time. The wolf turned and walked back into the trees and did not look back. Grace stared at her sister. What was that? Clara looked down at the hatchet in her hand. At the cheek of the blade, just behind the eye where the handle went through, there was a mark cut into the iron, small, almost invisible under the rust. A crescent shape and a single horizontal bar. She had noticed it years ago and had thought it was a maker's mark, the kind of thing foundries stamped into their tools. She understood now that it was not. She said, "It is a scout signal. Father told me about it once when I was young enough that I did not understand what he was really telling me. He said the Union scouts used it in the woods at night to warn off animals without making enough noise to bring an enemy patrol. 3 short, 1 long. He said the animals learn it from a single season of trappers using it. He said the wolves remember." She put the hatchet back in her belt. She said, "He gave us more than a key, Grace. He has been giving us more than a key our whole lives. We just did not know we were being given anything." They walked on. That evening, the bread was gone except for a piece the size of Clara's palm. And when she reached into the sack to break it, she felt the dampness and smelled the faint green-gray smell of mold rising from below. She held the remaining piece up in the last of the daylight. The bottom was furred with growth. She broke off what still seemed clean and divided it between them. They ate it in silence. After a while, Grace said in a voice that was very small, "We could go back." Clara did not answer right away. She thought about the foundling home, the thin corn husk mattress, the watery oatmeal always cold by the time it reached the children's table, the endless mending of clothes that were not hers for children. She was not allowed to love too openly, because Agnes Holt had learned from long experience that love was a form of leverage, and leverage was a form of danger. She thought about Tobias Fenn with his ear bleeding on the dark stairs. She thought about Warren Pruitt telling her to get out of his store. She thought about Reverend Voss walking away from the creek bank and the three women looking away. It was a miserable existence, but it was warm. There was a roof. There was food most of the time. She looked at the moldy bread in her hand. Then she thought about something she had not done since her father died. She had not opened the Thoreau. It had sat at the bottom of her flour sack for 6 years untouched, because touching it would mean accepting that he was not coming back to read it himself. She took it out now. Her fingers were stiff with cold. She opened the cover, and she found the letter. It was written in her father's hand, the careful, slanted script she had tried to teach herself to imitate when she was 9. It was on the inside of the front cover, written small, written to fit exactly in that space, written by a man who had measured the available room before he began, because he was a man who measured things before he began. She read it by the last of the fading daylight. She read it twice before she could believe what she was reading. It said, "If you are reading this, my girls, then the world has driven you out. I am sorry I was not there to protect you. But I have prepared a place. Go to the cave. The key opens the inner door. There is more inside than you will be able to see at first. Keep going. Your father loves you more than he ever found the words to say while he was alive." Clara's hand trembled. Just once. Then it steadied. She read the letter a 3rd time and a 4th time, and then she understood something that restructured every memory she had of her father. He had not simply hoped they would be all right. He had not trusted to Providence or the goodwill of the town. He had known. Not in a general worried way, the way any parent fears for their children. He had known specifically. He had known that one day his daughters would walk out of that building with a flour sack and a key and nothing else. And he had written a letter for that exact day and hidden it in a book he knew Clara would not open until she was desperate enough to need it. He had been preparing for this since before he died. The question that settled in her chest like a coal and stayed there, burning, was not whether her father had loved them. The question was, what had Elias Ashwood known about the town of Caldwell Hollow, and about the world that had made him so certain this day would come, Grace? She said. Grace looked up. "We keep going. Father wrote a letter. He knew." She held out the book. Grace read the letter in the last of the dusk. She did not speak. She handed the book back. She stood up and her legs trembled from 2 days of walking and 1 day of not enough food, and she pulled her sister to her feet. Then she said, "Then we walk." They walked into the dark on the strength of a dead man's letter, and they did not stop until the moon was high enough to see by, and they could no longer feel their feet. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they found the cave. It was less a cave than a scar in the face of a low hill, a dark slash in the limestone, partially hidden by a tangle of overgrown hawthorn that had been growing undisturbed for the better part of a decade. The entrance was small, barely tall enough to stand in. Set into the opening was a rotted wooden door on iron hinges, hand-forged and old, with a heavy padlock, blackened with rust, hanging from a hasp on the right side. Grace took the key from the cord around her neck. She put it in the lock. She turned. Nothing. The mechanism was frozen solid with years of rust and damp and disuse. She turned harder. Nothing. Clara stepped up beside her. She put her shoulder against the door above the lock and she pushed. The wood, soft with decades of rot, splintered at the frame. She pushed harder. With a sound like a bone giving way, the door swung inward and the darkness of the cave swallowed the light from outside as completely as deep water swallows a stone. They stood at the threshold and looked into nothing. For a moment, the despair came back complete and cold. Their father had sent them across 3 days of cold and hunger and wolf-haunted trails to die in a hole in the ground. The key had not even worked. The door had only opened because it had rotted through. There was nothing here but dark and stone and the smell of deep earth and old water. Then their eyes began to adjust, and they saw the scale of it. The entrance opened into a space far larger than the narrow opening had suggested. The ceiling arched upward into shadow. The floor was level packed earth and loose stone wide enough that both of them could walk side by side with room to spare. It was not a tomb. It was a room. It was the beginning of something. They went deeper, hands trailing along the cold, rough limestone of the walls. 20 paces in the wind from outside vanished. The roaring of it, which had been in their ears for 3 days, went away as completely as if someone had closed a door, and the silence that replaced it was so total and so sudden that Grace stopped walking and simply stood in it for a moment. 50 paces in the chill of the stone began to recede. Clara felt it first, a subtle shift against her cheek. The wall was no longer frigid. It was cool, but no longer cold in the way stone is cold when it has been soaked in winter air for months. She pressed her palm flat against the limestone and held it there. Warm. Not hot. Not even close to hot. But warmer than the air outside. Warmer than her own skin had been in 3 days. They kept going. And then they found the spring. A small, steady seep of water came from a fissure in the back wall, trickling down into a shallow basin that the water itself had worn in the limestone over some span of time that neither of them could calculate. The water pooled and drained away through a crack in the floor, with a soft, constant sound like breathing. Clara knelt. She dipped her fingers into the water. It was warm, not hot, not even close to uncomfortable, but warm the way a summer afternoon is warm, steady, and even, and coming from somewhere deep and unchanging inside the earth. indifferent to what the weather was doing on the surface, indifferent to the month or the year or the particular cruelty of this specific winter. Grace made a sound that was not a word. She sank down beside her sister and put both hands into the water and closed her eyes and held them there. They did not shout. They did not embrace. They sat in the deep, silent dark beside the warm spring and leaned against the limestone and felt something that did not have a name in the English language, or if it did, Clara had not learned it yet. It was not happiness. It was not relief, though. Relief was part of it. It was closer to recognition. The recognition of arriving somewhere you did not know you were going, but that now that you have arrived seems like the only place the road was ever leading. After a long while, Grace opened her eyes and looked at the wall above the spring. She said, "Clara, look." Clara raised the candle stub they had lit from the flint in the hatchet handle. The flame caught on the rough wall and she saw it, scratched into the limestone with the point of a knife. 2 letters and a year. EA 1864. Elias Ashwood. Their father. 9 years before this moment, in the 3rd year of a war that should have killed him a dozen times, he had been in this cave. He had hidden here. He had survived here. And before he left, he had taken a knife and scratched his initials into the wall above a warm spring, so that if his daughters ever came, they would know that he had been here first. He had not left them a worthless cave. He had left them the place that had kept him alive. Clara stood up. She put her hand on the wall beside her father's mark. Her fingers covered the letters in the year, and she felt the rough limestone under her palm and the faint warmth radiating from the rock itself. And she understood that she was touching something her father had touched. In the dark, in the worst year of his life, when he had also been alone and cold and not certain he was going to survive, he had survived. And he had found a way to stay with them in the one place where the world could not reach. She did not speak for a long time. When she did, her voice did not sound like her own. "He was here," she said. Grace nodded. She placed her own hand on the wall beside her sister's. "He was here," Grace said. "And now we are here, outside the cave beyond the hawthorn and the limestone, and the 3 days of distance they had put between themselves and the town that had cast them out. The first hard snow of the year began to fall in the high country of Western Virginia. It came down through the bare hardwoods and settled on the dark trail and began slowly, and without any particular urgency, to cover their tracks. The winter was here, the winter they had predicted, the winter no one in Caldwell Hollow had believed was coming, and the Ashwood sisters were already inside it. Part 2, The Kingdom. There is a particular kind of work that has no audience, no one watching, no one counting, no one to tell you that you are doing it correctly or that the effort is worth the cost. Just the work itself, and the body that is doing it, and the gap between what needs to be done and what has been done so far. Most people, when they encounter this kind of work, find ways to avoid it. They wait for better conditions. They wait for help. They wait for some sign that the outcome is certain before they commit to the effort. Clara and Grace Ashwood did not wait. They had been inside the cave for less than an hour when Clara began measuring the entrance, not with instruments, with her arm span and her foot length, and the kind of spatial reasoning her father had built into her over 8 years of showing her how to look at a thing and understand its dimensions before touching it. The entrance was 7 feet wide and 6 feet tall at its highest point. The door frame that remained was solid on the left side, rotted through on the right. The hinges were iron and old but not rusted through. The lock mechanism was the problem, frozen solid, but the hasp itself was sound. She could work with this. She could work with all of this. The first 3 days were about understanding what they had. They went deeper into the cave with the candle and mapped it the way their father had taught them to map unfamiliar terrain, starting from the known point and moving outward in careful increments, marking turns and chambers and ceiling heights. In Clara's ledger, with a stub of pencil she sharpened against the limestone wall. The main chamber was 40 paces deep and 20 wide. Behind it, a narrower passage ran another 30 paces back, before opening into a second smaller room where the warm spring was. The fissure in the ceiling of the main chamber ran for 12 feet east to west, at a height of about 20 feet. And when Clara held the candle below it and watched the flame, the draw was clean and strong and consistent. Her father had not found this cave by accident. He had chosen it. On the 4th day they began the wall. The deadfall pine on the slope above the cave entrance had been lying there for years, some of it since before the war. The wood dried and seasoned by years of freeze and thaw. Clara cut the notches the way her father had shown her when she was 9, and he was building a smokehouse behind the cabin. Slow, careful V-cuts into the ends of each log, so they locked together when stacked without needing nails or mortar. She had not understood at 9 why her father, a man who could have bought nails from any hardware store in the county, knew how to build things without them. She understood now. A man who spent 4 years moving through enemy territory in the dark learned to build things from what the land provided, because the land was always there, and the hardware store was not. Grace handled the dragging. She was not as strong as she looked, or rather, she was precisely as strong as she looked, which was not very. And the first log she dragged on the rope of twisted cedar bark left her palms raw and bleeding before she had covered 20 yards. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from the hem of her second dress and kept dragging. They did not discuss whether this was too hard. They discussed how many logs they needed to close the gap and how long each one would take and whether the cedar bark rope was going to hold or whether they needed to braid it differently. They filled the seams with mud and dry grass and moss pressed in with their fingers until the paste was solid. They reinforced the rotted door with fresh-cut pine limbs lashed across the inside with the cedar bark. They hung the wool shawl across the interior of the door frame as a second barrier against the wind. By the 7th day, they had a wall that stopped the cold at the entrance. They stood inside, and Clara put her hand flat against the logs and felt the wind pressing on the other side and not getting through. And she allowed herself 10 seconds of something that was not quite pride, but was close to it. Then she picked up the hatchet and went back to work. The hearth took 3 more days. The flat stones came from the creek bed a quarter-mile below the cave entrance, and carrying them up the slope 2 at a time was the kind of work that teaches you what your body is actually made of, as opposed to what you believed it was made of before you tried. Their backs became a single long ache that started at the base of the spine and climbed to the shoulder blades and stayed there. Their fingers cracked at the knuckles from the constant wet and cold, and the blood dried in small dark lines that Grace said made their hands look like maps of places neither of them had been. They laid the stones in a ring beneath the fissure in the ceiling, stacking them 3 courses high, and mortaring the gaps with the same clay and grass mixture they had used on the wall. Clara built the firebox in the back of the ring so the draft would pull the smoke toward the fissure naturally. She had seen her father do this once years ago, and she had not known she remembered it until her hands began doing it. The first fire was small, pine kindling and 1 split of dried oak. The smoke rose, hesitated at the level of the stone ring, swirled once, as if considering its options, and then drew straight up into the fissure and disappeared. Grace sat down on the cave floor and put her face in her hands. Then she laughed. It was the first laugh either of them had made since August, and it was not a happy sound. It was the sound a person makes when she has been bracing for a blow, and the blow does not come when the body releases the tension it has been holding for so long that the release itself feels violent. It was the sound of someone discovering that the thing she had built in the dark and the cold and without any certainty of success had actually worked. Clara looked at her sister and felt something loosen in her own chest. That night, Grace wrote in the ledger because Clara's hands were too cracked and sore to hold the pencil without pain, and Grace had always had the cleaner handwriting anyway. She wrote, "Today we built the first wall and the first hearth. The smoke draws clean. The spring is warm. We are not warm yet, but we are warmer. Father would be proud. He would also be sad that we needed to build this, but I think he knew we would." She read it aloud to Clara. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He knew we would. That is why he prepared it." Grace wrote that down too. On the morning of the 12th day, a dog barked. Not a frantic bark, not a warning. A single low announcement, the bark of an animal that has been trained to make itself known rather than to frighten. Clara heard it from inside the wall, and she was at the peephole gap before the echo had finished moving through the trees. A tall, thin old man stood in the trampled snow before the cave wall. 66 years old, though he looked older with the particular leanness of a man who has spent decades in country that does not forgive the carrying of excess weight. He wore dark buckskin that had been patched and repatched until the patches were older than some of the men in Caldwell Hollow. He held a long Kentucky rifle across his body with the muzzle pointed at the ground. Beside him sat a dog of mixed ancestry, gray and red and ribby with age, watching the wall with the patience of an animal that has waited beside its man in many uncomfortable places and has learned that the waiting always eventually resolves. The old man was not advancing. He was standing precisely where he had stopped, and he was waiting. Clara took the hatchet from her belt. She gave Grace a single look. Grace went to the back of the cave, to the hollow behind the spring that they had found on the 3rd day, where their father had left a Springfield rifle wrapped in waxed cloth, with a small pouch of percussion caps and a powder horn. Grace took it down from the shelf and began to load it. Her hands were steadier than Clara would have expected. The motions were correct. Powder patch, ball, ramrod, cap. Their father had taught them both in the last year before he died how to stand with a rifle. He had not taught them to shoot at a person. He had taught them how to make clear that shooting at a person was not outside the range of available options. Clara cracked the door of the wall. "Set the rifle down," she said. "Step back 20 paces." The old man looked at her through the gap. His eyes were the color of water over gray riverstone. He looked at her face and then at the hatchet, and then at the mark on the cheek of the hatchet blade. He held that look for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then he laid the Kentucky rifle in the snow at his feet and stepped back 20 paces, counting them out in long, even strides that suggested he had measured distances under pressure before and knew what 20 paces looked like in various kinds of terrain. The dog stayed where it was. Clara came out into the cold. She stood in the gap of the wall with the hatchet at her side, and she looked at the old man. And the old man looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, "You are the daughters of Elias Ashwood." Clara did not lower the hatchet. She said, "Who told you that?" He said, "Nobody told me. I saw the mark on the hatchet when you opened the door, the crescent and the bar. He cut that mark into the blade himself in this cave in August of 1864. I watched him do it with the same blade you are holding now." Something moved in Clara's chest. Not yet trust. Something preliminary to trust. A shift in the weight of the air between them. She said, "You knew our father." He said, "I owe him my life. His name was Solomon Reed." He told her the rest of it, standing in the cold with his rifle in the snow, 20 paces behind him, because he understood without being told that she would not let him any closer until she had heard enough to make a decision. And he respected that because Elias Ashwood had raised daughters worth respecting. In the 3rd week of July 1864, Solomon had been running from a Confederate cavalry column in the high country above the Shenandoah Valley, with a ball from an Enfield rifle in his left thigh and a fever that had been climbing for 4 days. He had been moving, not running, for 6 days before that, because running was no longer possible. Elias Ashwood had found him in a creek draw 3 miles from this cave, delirious and unable to stand without support. Elias had been on a different mission entirely. He had intelligence to deliver that could not wait. He delivered Solomon instead. He carried him the last mile on his back. They hid in this cave for 11 days, while the cavalry rode up and down the creek below looking for them. Elias kept the wound clean with water from the warm spring and strips torn from his own shirt, and a knowledge of field medicine that Solomon had never seen matched in a man who was not a trained surgeon. He fed Solomon from his own rations. He kept the fire small enough that the smoke was invisible from the valley below. When the column finally moved south, Elias carried Solomon out and walked him 2 days to a Union surgeon in West Virginia. "He saved my life," Solomon said, "and he never asked me for a single thing afterward. Except one. He asked me to stay away from Caldwell Hollow." Clara's hand had stopped trembling. She held the hatchet at her side, and she looked at this old man in his patched buckskin standing in the snow with his rifle behind him. And she said, "Why," Solomon looked at the ground between them. The dog, sensing some shift in the quality of the silence, lay down in the snow and put its chin on its paws. "Because he hated it there," Solomon said. "He came back from the war in '65, and he found that the men who had worn gray were still gray in their hearts, and the men who had worn blue were ashamed of it. And nobody in that town was willing to look clearly at what the war had actually cost them. He stayed because your mother had family in the churchyard, and she could not bear to leave them. He told me in a letter that his daughters would not be safe there if anything happened to him. He asked me to stay away because the day I came to Caldwell Hollow was the day his daughters were already in trouble. He paused. I saw your smoke, he said. Clara stood in the cold and looked at this man who had been a piece of her father's preparation for 9 years, waiting in the high country like a tool hung on a wall for the moment it would be needed. And she felt something she recognized as the particular grief of discovering that the person who loved you most had known more about the shape of your life than you had. She said, "Come inside. Bring the dog." He ate the food they had slowly in the way of a man who has learned that the next meal is never guaranteed. He looked at the new wall and the hearth and the drying rack near the fire, where thin strips of snare-caught rabbit were slowly becoming jerky. He looked at the two of them, at their cracked hands and their steady eyes, and the particular quality of their stillness that comes only to people who have been doing necessary work in difficult conditions for long enough that the difficulty has become ordinary. When he had finished eating, he set his bowl down and looked at them for a long time. He said, "I have lived in these mountains for 40 years. I have never seen two people build what you have built in 12 days, not with hands like yours. Not without help. Clara said we had help, just not the kind you can see in the room." Solomon nodded slowly. He understood exactly what she meant. He told them about their father then. He told them about the way Elias Ashwood had moved in the dark, like a man who had memorized the woods, the same way other men memorize scripture, with total faith and perfect recall. He told them about a morning in the Shenandoah when their father had done something terrible and necessary and had wept afterward, sitting in the dark with his hands in his lap, and had said, "That is enough. After this is over, I am going to go home. I am going to teach my daughters about the geese instead." Grace's eyes were wet during this part. She did not let the wet fall. When he was finished, Solomon reached into the inside pocket of his buckskin coat and took out something small and held it on his open palm. A percussion cap, copper old green with age at the edges. He said, "This is the last cap your father gave me in this cave in 1864, the day I left." He pressed it into my hand, and he said, "Keep it, you might need it someday." And I kept it for 9 years, and I never used it because it was not mine to use. It was always yours. He stood up and set it on the stone shelf above the hearth where the firelight could reach it. Clara looked at the cap for a long moment. Then she looked at Solomon Reed and she said, "Thank you for coming, for waiting, for keeping your word to him." Solomon said I kept half of it. The staying away part I kept. The other half I failed. I should have come when your parents died. You were 11 years old. I told myself you were safer in the foundling home than in the woods with an old man and a dog. I was a coward and I was wrong, and I have known I was wrong for 6 years. He paused. "I am here now," he said. Grace, who had been sitting quietly on the other side of the fire, stood up. She walked to where the old man sat. She put her hand briefly on the top of his shoulder, the same brief, deliberate touch she had given Tobias Fenn on the dark stairs of the foundling home. The touch of someone who has decided to accept a thing without requiring it to be more than it is. Solomon stayed 3 days. He showed them how to build a deadfall snare for a deer, a forked pole, and a length of braided sinew rope set in the narrow gap where the trail crossed a fallen log, positioned so the animal's own weight completed the mechanism. He showed them how to render the fat from the deer they took on the second morning, slow and careful in a small iron pot he carried in his pack, until it clarified into a pale gold liquid. They could pour into clay molds for candles or work into the leather of their boots to keep out the wet. He showed them which hardwoods made coals that held heat through the night, and which burned fast and left them cold before dawn. He showed them how to read the difference between a black bear marking territory before its winter sleep and a black bear still hunting because it had not eaten enough yet, and why the difference mattered to anyone walking those trails. On the third evening, he sat by the hearth for a long time without speaking. The dog, whose name was Captain, and who had warmed to grace somewhere around the second morning, lay against the warm stones with his chin on his front paws and his eyes half closed. Solomon stood up when the candle had burned low. He put on his coat. He picked up his rifle. He whistled once, and Captain rose and shook himself and went to stand beside his man. Solomon said, "I will come back. Not often, often enough." Then he went out through the gap in the wall, and the sound of his boots on the snow faded into the dark, and the silence of the cave returned, and it was a different kind of silence than the silence before he had arrived. Fuller, somehow, less empty, as if his presence had left something behind that was not quite warmth and not quite company, but was close to both. Clara sat by the fire for a long time after he left. She thought about what it meant that her father had prepared not only a cave and a letter and a set of tools, but a person. A man who would come when the smoke appeared. A man who had been waiting in the high country for 9 years for the signal that his dead friend's daughters were in the place they were supposed to be. Her father had not left them a key to a hole in the ground. He had left them a key to a system, and the system was still running. The discovery happened on a morning in the first week of October. Clara had gone to the back of the cave to fill the water bucket from the warm spring. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has been doing sustained physical labor without adequate food. A tiredness that lives in the bones rather than the muscles, and does not lift with a single night of sleep. The tallow candle she had poured the day before threw its light sideways across the low ledge of earth beside the spring basin, and the angle of the light showed her something she had walked past a dozen times without seeing. She stopped. She crouched. She put her hand flat against the soil. The earth was soft. The earth was warm. Not just slightly warmer than the air, the way soil sometimes holds the heat of a mild afternoon into the evening. Warm in the way of a living thing. A steady, even, bone-deep warmth that had nothing to do with the season or the surface temperature, or anything the almanac had ever predicted. And growing across the ledge in a cave in October in the Appalachian Mountains was a patch of moss the color of new grass in May. She sat down on the cave floor. She sat there for a long time. The same warmth that came from the spring came up through the earth around the spring. The same pulse of heat from whatever lay deep below the limestone. The same indifferent geological fact that had kept her father alive in the winter of 1864, was holding this small pocket of soil at the temperature of a mild afternoon all year without interruption. regardless of the month, regardless of the year, regardless of what the almanac said, or the minister preached, or the town below had decided to believe. She brought Grace. Grace knelt and put both hands flat on the warm earth and held them there. She looked at the moss. She looked at the soil. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "We have seeds." Clara said a few. Grace said, "We have candles." Clara said, "Several now." Grace said, "We have water." Clara said, "Always." Grace said, "And we have warm earth." Clara said, "Yes." Grace looked at her sister across the small, warm patch of impossible soil, and she said, "Mother always said that planting was an act of faith. I think she would say that planting underground in November is an act of stubbornness." Clara laughed. It surprised her. It came out of her from somewhere. She had forgotten she owned a place that had been sealed since September, since the morning Agnes Holt had closed the door on them. It was not a long laugh, but it was real and it was hers, and it felt like something returning. They turned the soil by lantern light, working it with their hands, and a flat piece of shale Clara shaped into a rough trowel. They mixed in leaf mold they had carried in from the forest floor outside, handfuls at a time until the earth was dark and loose and smelled of growing things rather than limestone. Then Clara reached into the bottom of the flour sack and took out the small linen pouch she had not yet mentioned to Grace. Grace looked at the pouch, then at her sister. Clara said, "I took them from the Foundling Home Garden the night before we left." Grace said, "You stole them." Clara said, "I borrowed them from a garden that was about to be buried under 3 feet of snow." They planted what they had: hardy lettuce, radish, kale, a small handful of late peas that had probably been in the pouch too long to be viable, but that Clara planted anyway because the cost of planting them was zero, and the cost of not trying was the same. They planted by candlelight in the back of a cave in the first week of October, in the mountains of Western Virginia, and they did not talk about whether it would work, because talking about whether it would work would have made it harder to do. 3 weeks later, the first shoots came up. They were pale, thinner than shoots grown in sunlight, reaching toward the candle flame rather than the sun. But they were green and they were alive, and they were growing in defiance of the season and the altitude and every assumption the town of Caldwell Hollow had made about what 2 17-year-old girls could or could not do when the world drove them out into the cold. Clara wrote in the ledger first, "Shoots visible. Lettuce and kale confirmed. Radish soil disturbed, suggesting movement below surface. The earth does not lie." She underlined the last sentence, her father's sentence. She underlined it twice. Cutter Drakey came on a night in November when the storm made so much noise in the trees that a man could move through the forest without being heard by most people. Clara heard him anyway, not because she had been listening for him specifically. She had been listening for everything the way her father had trained her to listen for everything. The way you listen when you are 17 years old and living alone in the high country, in the worst winter in memory. And you have learned that threats do not announce themselves with the face they intend to wear. She had cataloged the sounds of the mountain the way she cataloged everything else. The specific creak of the hawthorn against the wall in a north wind versus an east wind. The sound Captain made when he was passing through the area versus the sound he made when he had stopped and was investigating something. The difference between the silence of deep, undisturbed snow and the silence of a man standing still in deep snow. She heard footsteps at 40 yards, 30 yards. The rhythm was wrong. A man truly lost in a storm moves with the stumbling, searching rhythm of exhaustion and confusion. He moves toward any light and any warmth without strategy because he no longer has the capacity for strategy. These steps were deliberate. They knew where they were going. They had known before they started. She was at the wall before the first knock came. 3 knocks. Slow, evenly spaced, the knock of a traveler who does not want to startle the people inside. His voice, when it came through the gap in the logs, was trembling with cold. He said he was lost. He said his horse had gone down in the storm. He said, please, he was freezing, please. Clara put her ear against the wood of the door and listened to him breathe. A man who is genuinely freezing to death does not breathe the way Cutter Drake was breathing. A man freezing to death has the ragged, shallow, effortful breath of a body working with everything it has left just to maintain consciousness. The man on the other side of the door was breathing with the slow, controlled regularity of a person who was cold, because it was a cold night, not because he was dying of it. She said through the gap, "Sir, what is in your right hand?" A silence, not the silence of confusion, the silence of recalculation. He said, "My hand." She said, "Your right hand. What is in it?" A longer silence. Then the pretense came off his voice the way a coat comes off a man who has decided the performance is over. He said, "A knife." She said, "And the left." He said, "A stick." She said, "You will set them both in the snow. You will step back 20 paces. When I see that you have done it, I will throw a packet of dried meat over the wall. That is everything you will receive from us tonight." Do you understand? What came back through the door was not an answer. It was a different voice, entirely lower and older and weighted with the particular gravity of a grievance that has been carried so long it is calcified into something that feels like righteousness. He said he knew her father. He said her father had killed his cousin Asa at Petersburg in the summer of 1864. Killed him in a trench from 100 yards in the dark, where Asa never even saw the gun. He said he had come to collect a debt that nobody else had the courage to collect. He said, "Open the door." Grace behind Clara had already taken the Springfield from the shelf. Her hands were shaking not badly, and the motions were correct. Powder patch ball ramrod cap. Their father had taught them both. Clara did not turn from the door. She said, "My father was never at Petersburg." She said it the way her father had taught her to say true things without heat and without apology, as a statement of fact that does not require the other person's agreement in order to remain true. She said, "My father served in the Shenandoah Valley from August through the end of 1864. He was at Cedar Creek in October of that year. He was never in southeastern Virginia in his life. Whoever killed your cousin, it was not Elias Ashwood. You have carried this grief to the wrong door." A silence. Then he hit the door with the stick. It was a two-handed swing, and it was hard enough that the pine limbs lashed across the inside of the door shuddered with the impact. The cedar bark lashings held. He hit it again. The wall held. He hit it a third time, and the door shuddered in its frame and held again. And he was saying something now, not quite shouting, but past the point of controlling his volume, saying that he had a hate older than she was and she could not reason with it. And her father had not left her safe in here. He had left her in a hole that could be found, and she needed to open the door now, or he would find wood that would burn and use it. Clara stood at the gap. She was not unafraid. She was afraid in the way of someone who has already decided what she is going to do, regardless of what she feels. So the fear existed as information, rather than as instruction. She said quietly and clearly, "There is a man on the ridge above you with a rifle. He is the man my father sent to watch over us. He has been watching this door since before you knocked. If you raise that stick one more time, he will fire. I am telling you this because I want you to have a choice." She was not telling the complete truth. Solomon was not on the ridge that she knew of. Solomon was in his cabin 1.5 miles to the north, but she had heard something 2 minutes ago, faint beneath the storm noise that she had filed away and was now using. A single low bark from somewhere on the slope above the cave. Captain's voice, Solomon's dog. The bark that meant something is here and you should know about it. Cutter Drakey heard it too. She could feel him go still on the other side of the door, the way a large animal goes still when it registers a sound it cannot immediately place. Above them on the ridge, a rifle shot cracked through the storm. One shot, clean and deliberate. The bullet struck the limestone face of the cliff above the cave entrance and sang off into the dark in a direction that made absolutely clear it had been aimed to produce maximum sound and 0 casualties. Solomon Reed had come down from the high country in the middle of a storm without anyone asking him to. He had seen tracks or heard the voice or felt with the instinct of a man who had spent 40 years in those mountains that something was wrong in the direction of the cave. He had positioned himself on the ridge above and waited, and when the moment arrived, he had fired exactly the shot the moment required. Not to kill, to make a point. The silence after the shot lasted 3 full seconds. Then Cutter Drake dropped the stick. Clara heard it hit the snow. The knife followed. His footsteps, no longer deliberate and no longer confident, moved away through the trees in the direction he had come from, diminishing into the storm. And by morning, the snow had covered every trace of him. A long time later, the door opened and Solomon Reed came in from the cold with snow in his beard and his rifle slung across his back. He took off his hat. His hands were shaking. Grace saw it before Clara did. She set the Springfield on the stone table and walked to where the old man was standing and took his hands in both of hers and held them still. She said, "My father did the same. After the war, every night his hands shook when he thought we couldn't see. He told us once that the war doesn't end when the guns stop. He said it takes years to put it down." Solomon closed his eyes. He said, "I have not fired at a man in 8 years, Miss Grace." She said, "I know." He said he would have killed you both. She said, "I know." The 3 of them stood in the cave for a long time without speaking. And outside, the storm continued to do what storms do in the Appalachian high country, which is to say it continued without reference to the lives being lived below it, patient and indifferent and absolute in its disinterest. Clara stood by the hearth and looked at the percussion cap on the stone shelf above the fire. The last thing her father had given Solomon Reed in this cave 9 years ago. The thing Solomon had carried through all the years between and brought back to them. She understood something now that she had been working toward for weeks. assembling the pieces without yet seeing the whole shape. The cave was warm. The wall held. The spring flowed. The shoots were coming up through the dark, warm earth at the back of the cave. Solomon Reed had come down a ridge in a November storm because Elias Ashwood had built a system with that outcome designed into it. Every piece of it, the key, the letter, the hatchet, marked the signal the man himself had been placed by a man who was no longer alive to place anything, and yet was somehow still placing things exactly where they needed to be. Exactly when they needed to be there. Her father was dead, and he was still here. And then the letter came. It arrived through a channel Clara had not anticipated. A boy from Caldwell Hollow, who sometimes carried messages for people in the high country, had passed within a half-mile of the cave on an errand unrelated to them. Solomon had encountered him on the trail, and the boy had a letter folded in his coat pocket that he had been asked to deliver if he got close enough. A letter from a 12-year-old boy who had spent 2 months carefully working up the courage to commit his fear to paper. The handwriting was slow and deliberate, each letter formed with the effort of a child taught to write by a mother who had not lived long enough to see him become fluent at it. It said, "I still believe you. Mrs. Holt is counting the flour every morning now. The babies are crying at night. I am afraid. Your friend, Tobias." Clara read it once. She set it on the stone table. She did not move for a long moment. She had built this place. She had built the wall and the hearth and the drying racks and the underground garden and the life inside the stone. She had done it because there was no other option, and because her father had left her a place to do it, and because the alternative was to die in a ditch on the Western Trail. She had done it to survive. But Tobias Fenn was lying on a corn-husk mattress 20 miles down the mountain, counting the cries of children smaller than himself, and waiting for a winter that Clara had told him was coming, and that had now fully arrived. She looked at Grace. Grace looked at her. Neither of them spoke because the conversation had already happened in some version of themselves that existed before language. It had been happening since the night Tobias had stood in the doorway with his candle and his knife and offered everything he had, which was very little, and they had sent him back to his room with everything still his, which was still very little, but was at least still his. He had not forgotten them. He had written it down and sent it up the mountain. They were not going to forget him. Clara picked up her father's ledger. She opened it to the last entry. She read the sentence she had underlined twice. Then she turned to a new page and wrote in her own hand, without underlining it, because some things do not need emphasis to carry their full weight. Wait, Father prepared a place. He did not prepare us to leave it. That part is ours. She closed the ledger. Outside the cave, the winter that no one in Caldwell Hollow had believed was coming continued to deepen, continued to close the roads and thin the flour, and silence the town under its white accumulating weight. It would be the worst winter in the memory of anyone living in the western reaches of Virginia. It would last until April, and in the warm dark of a cave that a dead man had chosen, and a daughter had built into a home, a young woman sat by a fire she had made from wood. She had cut and looked at a letter from a boy she had not been allowed to love too openly, and understood that surviving was only the first part of what she had come here to do. The second part was harder. The second part was going back. Part 3, The Return. There is a difference between a door that is closed and a door that is locked. Clara Ashwood had spent the first 17 years of her life learning that difference. The foundling home had been locked. The general store had been locked. The town's goodwill had been locked behind 8 years of unspoken war grievance and unresolved shame, and the particular human tendency to mistake stubbornness for principle. But a locked door is not a sealed one. Locks require keys, and Clara had learned from her father that the right key is not always made of iron. Sometimes it is made of green leaves in December. Sometimes it is made of a woman walking 2 days through the snow with 2 thin chickens on her back. Sometimes it is made of a 12-year-old boy who writes down his fear and sends it up a mountain because he has no other way to say that he still believes. The first test of whether Clara truly meant to go back came before any of that on a night in late November, when the storm had paused and the cold had settled into the kind of hard, bright stillness that follows a heavy snow in the mountains. He knocked 3 times, slowly, quietly. The knock of someone who is not sure of his welcome and has decided to announce himself rather than demand. Clara was at the wall before the 3rd knock finished. She put her eye to the peephole gap and looked out into the moonlit snow, and she recognized him immediately. Not his face, which she could not see clearly in the dark, but his shape, the particular way he held his shoulders, and the absence of anything in his hands. Cutter Drake. No stick, no knife. His hands were at his sides, and they were empty, and he was standing in the snow outside the wall of the cave that he had tried to break through 3 weeks ago, and on his back, held in place by a length of cloth tied across his chest, was a small child. Clara stood at the peephole for a long moment. She could hear the child from inside the wall, not crying. Something worse than crying. The thin, labored breathing of a young body, fighting a fever that had been winning for too long. She said through the gap how old his voice, when it came, had none of the weight it had carried 3 weeks ago. It was flat and tired and stripped of everything but the fact it was trying to communicate. He said 4 years old, 3 days with the fever. I do not know where else to go. Clara was quiet. She thought about what her father had prepared. The cave, the letter, the signal on the hatchet, Solomon Reed waiting in the high country. All of it designed, all of it planned. Her father had thought of everything he could think of, and he had prepared for all of it. He had not prepared for this moment. This was not in any plan. This was not in any letter. This was the moment that belonged entirely to Clara, the first decision of her life that her father had not laid the groundwork for, that no one had laid the groundwork for, that she had to make alone on the strength of nothing but her own understanding of what kind of person she intended to be. She looked at Grace, who was standing behind her with the Springfield. Grace looked back at her. Clara opened the door. She said, "Bring the child in. You will sit where I can see you. You will not move from where I put you. Do you understand?" He said yes. He came inside. He was thinner than he had been 3 weeks ago, and his coat was inadequate for the winter they were having, and his boots were wet through. Clara directed him to the bench farthest from the door. He sat. He untied the cloth and brought the child around from his back and held the boy against his chest, and the boy's breathing filled the cave with its awful sound. Grace was already at the medicine rack, mullein, wild cherry bark, the time they had grown in the warm earth. She had a pot of water heating on the hearthstones before Clara had finished closing the door. Clara knelt in front of Cutter Drake. She looked at the child. The boy's face was flushed and his eyes were closed, and his breath came in small, wet rasps. She said, "How long since he ate?" Cutter said, "Yesterday morning. A little broth." She said, "Does he have a cough or just the fever?" He said, "Both. The cough started 2 days ago." She reached out and put her hand on the boy's forehead. Hot. Not dangerously so yet, but climbing. She said his name. Cutter said Eli. I named him after my father. Clara stood up. She went to help Grace with the medicine. They worked in silence for a time, the two sisters, while Cutter sat on the bench and held his son and did not speak. The fire burned. The water heated. The smell of the herbs began to fill the cave with something that was almost like summer. After a while, Cutter said, "I know your father was not at Petersburg." Clara did not turn from the hearth. He said, "I have known it for 2 years. Asa's regiment commander wrote a letter. There was no Union scout named Ashwood anywhere near Petersburg in '64. The Pike family told me that information did not matter. I told myself it did not matter either. It was easier than the alternative." Clara brought a small cup of the tea to where he sat. She held it out for the boy and showed Cutter how to hold the cup to the child's lips, just enough to wet them, just enough to get a small amount down. She said, "Drink some yourself. You are half frozen." He looked at her. She said, "The boy needs you functional. Drink." He drank. The child slept fitfully through the night with one of them always nearby, checking the breathing, adjusting the warmth, giving small amounts of the tea when the boy stirred. Cutter sat on the bench and did not sleep, and did not cause any trouble, and did not ask for anything beyond what he had been given. In the morning, the boy's fever had dropped, not gone, but lower. His breathing was cleaner. He opened his eyes once and looked around the cave with the unfocused, wondering look of a sick child in an unfamiliar place, and then closed them again and slept more peacefully than he had since arriving. Cutter Drake sat on the bench and looked at his sleeping son and did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "I do not know how to account for this. Clara was at the morning fire. She said you do not have to account for it. He said I tried to break down your door. She said you did. The wall held. He said I threatened you. She said you did. We were not harmed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why did you open the door?" Clara looked at the sleeping child on the bench. She said, "Because he is 4 years old. And because whatever you did or did not do is between you and your own conscience. It is not his inheritance." Cutter Drake put his face in his hands. He did not make any sound, but his shoulders moved once briefly and then went still. Grace brought broth for the child when he woke in the mid-morning, and the boy drank a small amount and kept it down, and by the afternoon his color had shifted from the dangerous flush of high fever to the pale exhaustion of a fever breaking. Grace showed Cutter how to prepare the medicine tea, the proportions and the timing, and wrote it down for him in the margin of a piece of paper in her careful handwriting, so he would not have to remember it without help. They left the next morning, Cutter with the boy on his back again, but breathing steadily now, breathing in the clean, uncomplicated way of a child who has come through something and is on the other side of it. At the door of the wall, Cutter stopped. He turned. He said, "I will not trouble you again." Clara said, "If the boy's fever returns in the next week, come back. Bring him early, not late." He looked at her. He said, "I will remember what you did here." He went down the mountain and she watched until the trees took him. And then she went back inside and closed the door and stood by the fire for a moment, with her hand on the stone of the hearth, feeling the warmth her father had designed into this place, thinking about the decision she had just made and whether it had been the right one. Grace said from across the cave, it was right. Clara said, "I know." Grace said he did not deserve it. Clara said the boy did. Grace said yes. They did not speak about it again. But Clara wrote one line in the ledger that evening below the entry about the medicine and the child's recovery. "Today I made a decision my father did not make for me. I believe he would have made the same one. I cannot be certain. That is the point." The first person to come openly for help was Rowena Hale. She arrived on a Thursday in the first week of December, and she arrived alone, which mattered more than anything else about her arrival. She had not told anyone she was going. She had not asked permission. She had put on her grandfather's old wool greatcoat and strapped a wicker basket to her back with 2 thin chickens inside it, and walked out of Caldwell Hollow before the sun was fully up. She fell twice on the way, once on the iced-over creek crossing at the bottom of the ridge and once on the steep section of trail above the hemlock draw where the snow had drifted to hip height. Both times she got up and kept walking. She did not turn back, not because she was not afraid, but because she had decided before she left that turning back was not one of the available options. She had been making decisions that way since her husband James had been killed at Cold Harbor in June of 1864. She was 38 years old. She had 2 children, a daughter named Beth, who was 7, and a boy named James Jr., who was 4, and who had been coughing for 3 weeks with a rattle in his chest at night that she had lain awake beside for long enough that she no longer trusted her own assessment of whether it was getting worse. She knocked on the wall of the cave at midday. When Clara opened the door and stood in the gap looking at her, Rowena tried twice to say what she had come to say. Twice the words dissolved before they formed. It was Grace who took the basket off her back. It was Clara who guided her to the bench by the hearth. It was Captain Old and Gray and Knowing Who came and placed his head on her knee with the gentleness of an animal that understands grief from long proximity to it. She drank 2 cups of broth before she could speak. She said, "I came because my boy has a cough that will not leave. I came because there is no flour left in my house and the shelves at the store are thinning faster than anyone is saying out loud. But that is not all of why I came." She set the cup down. She looked at the fire. She said, "I sat in that church for 9 years. I heard them call your father what they called him. I sat in the 3rd pew on the left, which is the Union side, and I said nothing. I told myself I was protecting my children. I was a coward, Clara. Your father and my husband wore the same color. I owed his daughters my voice for 9 years, and I kept it for myself. I am sorry." Clara did not answer the apology directly. She had learned from her father that apologies, when they are sincere, are not the part that requires the response. The part that requires the response is what comes next. She said, "How old is the boy?" Rowena said, 4. Clara said, "Tight chest or wet?" Rowena said, "Wet." There is a rattle when he sleeps. Grace was already moving. Mullein, wild cherry bark, thyme from the cave garden. She wrapped them in clean linen and told Rowena how to prepare them. Boil in a quart of water, steam under a blanket, twice a day, tea 3 times. The boy would be better in 4 days. Then Grace went to the back of the cave and returned with something wrapped twice in linen. She set it on the table and folded back the cloth. 8 pale green leaves of lettuce, harvested that morning from the warm, dark earth of the cave floor, growing in December in the mountains of western Virginia by the light of tallow candles and the warmth of the earth below. Rowena looked at the leaves for a long time. Then the tears came down her face and she did not wipe them. Clara said, "When you go back, do not tell anyone about the leaves. Tell them about the venison and the firewood and the medicine. Let them come for the things they can understand. The leaves are not something they are ready for yet. Let them come for hunger first." Rowena nodded. She left at dawn with her basket heavier than it had been going up, and the story she carried into Caldwell Hollow moved through the town the way true stories move quietly, and from one person to the next, in the spaces between the things people say in public. 8 days after Rowena's visit on a Sunday morning in the second week of December, Reverend Edmund Voss climbed into his pulpit with his congregation noticeably thinner than it had been a month before. 2 families had not come at all. The Larkin baby had been buried in frozen ground that had taken 3 days to break open. The communal woodpile was shrinking at a rate that no one was discussing publicly, but that everyone had privately calculated. He did not preach his prepared sermon. He looked at his congregation and saw what was in their faces, and he made a decision that in retrospect he would understand as the last wrong decision of his time in that pulpit. He preached about pride. He said that those who would walk to that cave in the hills and beg from 2 girls who had been cast out for false prophecy were walking away from God. He said hunger was a test of faith. He was 3 sentences into the argument when Rowena Hale stood up. She had not stood up in a public room since the morning the telegram about James had arrived. She stood up now with James Jr. on her hip and Beth beside her in the pew, and the entire congregation turned to look at her. She said, "Reverend Voss, you are asking my son to die so that your sermon can be right." The silence in the church had weight. It pressed against the windows. She said, "My husband died wearing the same color as Elias Ashwood. He died believing it was worth dying for. I have been silent in this room for 9 years, and I will not be silent any longer. If walking to that cave is walking away from God, then God and I have a conversation ahead of us that does not require your pulpit." She sat down. In the back pew on the right side of the church, Warren Pruitt sat very still. He had not slept well in 3 weeks. The night before, he had taken down from a high shelf in the back room of his store a daguerreotype of his brother Henry taken in Lynchburg in the spring of 1862. He had sat with it for 2 hours by candlelight. He had asked the picture a question he had been afraid to ask for 9 years. The picture had not answered, but by the time the candle burned down, he had known what Henry would have said, because Henry had always been the clearer of the 2 of them. He stood up. He was the second person in the history of the Caldwell Hollow Methodist Church to stand up during a sermon without being invited to. He said, Reverend, I will walk with Mrs. Hale." Voss stared at him. He said, "Warren, you fought for the Confederate States." Warren said, "I did." Voss said, "You lost a brother at Petersburg." Warren said, "I did." Voss said, "And you would walk with a Union widow to the daughters of a Union scout." Warren Pruitt stood in his pew in his old Sunday wool, and his hands were at his sides, and his voice was not trained for public speaking, but it was steady. He said, "Reverend, my brother has been dead 9 years. If he could see me now letting 23 children go hungry because I'm too proud to walk up a mountain, he would not know me. I do not want to be a man my brother would not know." He sat down. The silence in the church changed. It did not break. It changed the way weather changes, not all at once, but in the quality of the air and the pressure of the room and the unspoken sense of what is about to happen next. Reverend Edmund Voss stood in his pulpit with his sermon notes in front of him and the eyes of his congregation on his face, and he said nothing for the longest 40 seconds of his ministry. Then he closed the Bible. He stepped down from the pulpit. He walked the length of the aisle and out the front door of the church without speaking, and the cold came in briefly through the open door, and then was gone. He did not preach in Caldwell Hollow for 2 more weeks. The night after the church service, Agnes Holt sat alone in her office in the Foundling home and did something she had not done in 51 years. She thought about her mother, not the controlled, carefully managed version of the memory she had maintained for 5 decades, the version she had packaged and stored at a safe distance. She thought about Eleanor Holt the way you think about a person, when you finally stop managing the memory and let it come. The kitchen, the smell of drying herbs, the sound of her mother's voice explaining which root was for which purpose and why. The patience of a woman who believed that knowledge shared was the only kind of knowledge that mattered. She thought about the hinge of the wood box under the window. She had oiled it once a week for 20 years so it would not squeak. She had maintained that habit without examining why until this moment. She had kept it quiet so she could hide there again if she needed to. She opened the left drawer of her desk. She took out the small bronze disc on its tarnished ribbon. She set it on the desk and looked at it in the lamplight. She had kept it because it was the only piece of Elias Ashwood she had, and because keeping it felt like keeping something of Mary Ashwood too, who had been the kindest woman Agnes had ever known, and because somewhere in the unexamined part of herself, she had always understood that those girls were going to need it one day. She was ready to give it back. But she was not going to send it. She was going to bring it herself. She packed a small bundle before dawn. Bread, a flask of apple cider, her dead husband's old muffler. She told the assistant matron she would be gone 3 days, and she walked out of the Foundling home before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. She did not look back at the building she had run since 1856. She fell more times than she could count. On the second night, she slept in the shelter of a fallen oak with snow drifting against her back, and she was almost certain she would not wake up. And she found that the certainty did not frighten her the way she had always assumed it would. She had been carrying a weight for 51 years, and the weight was exhausting, and the idea of setting it down, in whatever form the setting down took, had lost most of its terror. Somewhere on the slope below the hemlock draw, She opened her eyes in the morning. She arrived at the cave at the end of the third day. The light was failing. Her hands were the color of the inside of an oyster shell, and she could not feel her feet. And the last quarter mile had been a negotiation between her will and a body that had developed strong reservations about the enterprise. Clara opened the door. The two women looked at each other across the threshold in the last light of a December afternoon. The matron of the Caldwell Hollow Foundling Home and the girl she had cast out into a September storm 3 months before. What passed between them in that moment was not forgiveness. It was not accusation. It was the recognition of two people who have both traveled a very long distance and arrived at the same place by different roads and are standing at the threshold, looking at each other with the exhaustion of arrival. Clara said, "Come in, Mrs. Holt." Grace made tea. Solomon, who had come down that morning as he sometimes did when something in the air told him to give up his seat by the hearth without comment, and went to sit with Captain at the back of the cave. Captain regarded Agnes Holt for the full evening with the steady, patient distrust of an old dog who has learned to read certain kinds of people on sight and sees no reason to revise his assessment before the evidence changes. The evidence did not change his assessment that evening. Agnes drank 2 cups of tea. She ate a small bowl of venison broth. She sat by the fire and let the feeling come back into her hands and her feet. And she did not speak for nearly 2 hours. The silence was not comfortable, but it was productive, the kind in which something is being worked toward that cannot be approached through talking. When she spoke, her voice was one that neither sister had heard her use. Lower, older. The voice of a woman setting down something she has carried at the wrong angle for so long that she can no longer remember how to hold herself without it. She said, "My mother's name was Eleanor Holt. She was born in 1791 in a town in western Massachusetts that no longer exists on any map. She was a midwife and an herbalist. She delivered most of the babies born in that town between 1810 and 1822. She knew which plants brought a fever down and which brought it up, and which roots would stop a bleeding after birth. She had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from her mother going back further than anyone could trace." She paused. The fire settled. A log shifted and sent a brief column of sparks toward the fissure. In the autumn of 1822, she said a family in the town lost 3 children in 1 week to a sickness nobody could name. The mother of those children had never liked my mother. She stood up in the meeting house on the Sunday after the 3rd child died, and she said that Eleanor Holt was a witch. She said my mother had cursed her babies. She said the proof was that no Christian woman should know what my mother knew about the bodies of women and the management of birth and death. Clara had not moved. Grace had set her cup down. Agnes said it was not Salem. Salem had been over for 130 years. We told ourselves we did not do that anymore. We were wrong. There were towns in New England and Pennsylvania and upstate New York all through the first part of this century where they still did it. They did not call it witchcraft. They did not hold trials. They did it in kitchens. They did it quickly. And the law called it a private matter. She looked into the fire. "I was 4 years old," she said. "I was hiding in the wood box under the window of the kitchen. I heard the men come in. I heard what they did. I stayed in the box until they were gone, and then I came out. and my mother was on the floor, and I sat down beside her and held her hand. She did not die for 2 more days. She did not speak again. I sat under the kitchen table and held her hand and felt the cold come up through the floor and into her hand, and then further up until there was no warmth left anywhere. The cave was very quiet. Agnes said, "I have spent 51 years trying to make certain that no girl I was responsible for would ever stand up in a public place and say something true that the men in the room did not want to hear. I thought, if I could teach them not to write things down, not to read the birds, not to know what their bodies knew, I could keep them alive. I cast you out, Clara, because I believed that if I let you stay, you would one day stand in a room and say something true, and the men would come for you the way they came for my mother." She stopped. She looked at her hands in her lap. "I was wrong," she said. "I was wrong in the method and wrong in the reasoning and wrong for 51 years in every direction. The method did not protect anyone. It only guaranteed that the girls I raised would be afraid of their own understanding and alone in that fear. I do not ask you to forgive me. I came here to tell you the truth. It is the only thing I could think of that might be worth the trip." The fire burned low. Outside, the mountain was perfectly silent under its cover of snow. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Holt, I am sorry about your mother." Agnes closed her eyes. "Clara said you were wrong about the method. I will not tell you that you were right in what you did because you were not, and you know that. But I understand the fear. I understand that you thought you were building walls to protect us. The difference between your mother and mine is not that mine knew less. My mother knew the same things. She grew the same plants and helped the same women and kept the same knowledge. The difference is that my mother had people who knew her name, friends who would have spoken for her, a husband who would have stood in any doorway that needed standing in. The thing that kept my mother safe was not silence. It was belonging." She paused. "What I'm telling you, Mrs. Holt, is that you could have had that. You did not have to do this alone. You could have told someone, any of us, at any point in 6 years. We would have known you. It would have been enough." Agnes Holt put her face in her hands. She wept the way a person weeps who has not permitted herself to weep in 51 years, with the total ungoverned shaking release of a grief that has been stored under pressure for longer than most people's lives. She wept until the fire burned low, and Grace rose to feed it without a word. She wept until Captain, who had maintained his judgment all evening, finally stood and walked across the cave and lay down at her feet. Because even a dog who is not persuaded by a person will respond to that quality of grief, with that quality of gesture. She slept that night on the bench by the hearth with the dog at her feet. In the morning, she ate breakfast with the sisters and with Solomon, and she did not explain anything further. And she did not ask for anything. When she was ready to leave, she stood and put on her coat and her husband's muffler and walked to the door of the wall. Then she stopped. She reached into her coat pocket. She set the bronze disc on the stone table beside the door. She did not place it in Clara's hand. She did not make a ceremony of it. She set it down. The way you set down something you have been carrying at the wrong angle for too long, with the relief of a body finally finding its correct alignment. Then she walked out into the snow and did not look back, and the metal caught the firelight on the stone table and was the color of something that had been waiting a long time to come home. Reverend Edmund Voss and Warren Pruitt came together on the 2nd day of February. They came for the foundling home. 23 children. The flour was gone. The salt pork was a memory. Tobias Fenn had a fever of 103 and had not eaten in 2 days, and the younger children had stopped asking when there would be more food and had moved into the quiet and terrible patience of children who have learned that asking does not produce results. The 2 men stood at the front wall of the cave in the late morning light. Voss had prepared a speech during the 4-hour walk-up through thigh-deep snow. It contained several passages from the Gospel of Luke. It was considered as a speech quite good. He got 4 words into it before Clara raised her hand. He stopped. Warren Pruitt spoke before the Reverend could find his place again. He said, "Miss Ashwood, I am not here on behalf of the church. I am here on behalf of my brother." He was not a man accustomed to saying things in public that he actually meant, and the effort of it showed in the rigidity of his posture, the posture of a man who has decided to do something before he has finished being afraid of doing it. He said Henry Pruitt was killed at Petersburg in the summer of 1864. Not by your father. I have known for a long time that it was not your father. Your father was in a different part of the state entirely. I let myself forget it because forgetting was easier than looking directly at the fact that I spent 8 years angry at a dead man for the wrong reason and let that anger cost his daughters what it cost them. He stopped. He looked at the snow between his boots. He said if my brother were alive today, he would not let 23 children go hungry over a war that ended 8 years ago. He would walk up a mountain in February to help the daughters of a man who wore the other color, because he was a better man than I have been. I am here to do what he would have done. That is the only reason I am here, and it is enough of a reason. Clara looked at him for a long time. She looked at the snow on his coat, and the gray in his beard, and the way his hands worked on the strap of the empty canvas sack he had carried up the mountain. She said, "How many children, Mr. Pruitt?" He said, 23. And Tobias has a fever. She said, "How much can the 2 of you carry?" He said, "As much as you give us." Grace was already moving. She brought down smoked venison wrapped in waxed cloth, smoked trout that Solomon had traded them in January from a stream he kept in a high valley that appeared on no map anyone in Caldwell Hollow had ever seen. Bundles of dried roots and herbs. 3 parcels of fresh kale and lettuce wrapped twice in linen and then in waxed cloth to survive the trip down. They filled both sacks the men had brought, and then they filled a 3rd sack that Solomon, who had come down that morning with the same quiet sense of timing that had become his particular contribution to all of their lives, produced from his own pack without being asked. When the sacks were full and tied and stacked by the door, Reverend Edmund Voss reached into the inside of his heavy coat. He took out a small leather-bound Bible, its cover worn smooth by years of hands, the spine reinforced with a strip of replacement leather that was a slightly different color from the original. He held it out to Clara. He said this was your mother's. It was kept in a drawer at the foundling home. It should have been given to you the day you left. Mrs. Holt has asked me to bring it to you along with this. He reached into his other pocket. He took out a small bronze disc on a frayed ribbon and placed it on top of the Bible in Clara's outstretched hands. Clara looked at them. Her mother's Bible worn smooth by her mother's hands. Her father's medal, which Agnes Holt had carried for 6 years. In the only way she knew how to honor the people she had been afraid to fully protect. She held them both against her chest with both arms. She stood in the doorway of the cave her father had survived in during the worst year of his life. And she held the 2 objects that were all that remained of the 2 people who had made her. And she did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Reverend Voss." She said, "The snow is deepest on the eastern slope below the second ridge. Stay in the tree line on your way down. The wind will be at your back from the cave to the first creek crossing. After the crossing, lean into it. It shifts from the north on the lower trail in the afternoon." Then she said, "Tell Tobias Fenn that I asked after him. Tell him I have kept faith with his father's knife, which is safe here until he is old enough to carry it without anyone taking it from him." Voss opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He put on his hat. He shouldered his sack. He turned and started down the mountain and did not speak again. And in the set of his shoulders there was something that was not quite defeat and not quite relief, but was the specific bearing of a man who has set down a weight he has been carrying at the wrong angle and is discovering what it feels like to walk without it. Warren Pruitt followed him. Halfway down the slope where the trail ran under a stand of old hemlocks, Warren stopped. He turned and looked back up the mountain. The wall and the door and the thin line of smoke rising from the fissure in the hillside were just barely visible through the trees. He stood there for a long moment with his brother, somewhere in the back of his mind. Not the daguerreotype version, the living version. The one who had laughed too loudly and argued about everything and gone off to war with a certainty about right and wrong that Warren had never quite matched and had always quietly envied. He said nothing to the trees or to his brother or to the smoke rising above the cave. He turned and went on down the mountain, and there was in his step something that had not been there on the way up. The winter broke in the second week of April. The road from the east opened on the 18th. The supply wagons arrived on the 23rd. The town counted its dead in May standing in the cemetery in the thin warmth of an Appalachian spring and looking at the fresh mounds that the winter had produced. 16 dead, 3 children, 11 adults. 2 old men who had, as people said, been ready. Among the children was the youngest daughter of the Larkin family who had not come to church on the Sunday. Rowena Hale stood up. The Larkins did not blame Rowena. They left for Tennessee in the fall and were not heard from again. Tobias Fenn lived. He came to the cave for the first time on the 3rd of May, walking the 2-day trail in the new warmth of spring, with a blank ledger book wrapped in oilcloth tucked under his arm. He had bought it with 2 months of savings from chopping wood for families near the foundling home. He stood at the wall of the cave, and when Clara opened the door, he held the ledger out and said, without stuttering, which he managed sometimes, when what he was saying mattered enough to override the fear of saying it, "Will you teach me how to write what you write?" She taught him. He came twice a week until the snow returned. He came twice a week the following year. He learned to read the creek marks and the bird patterns and the behavior of the high clouds, and he learned to write it all down with the same precision Clara had learned from her father. He added things Clara had not thought to include the patterns of illness in the hollow. the way certain fevers move through certain families in certain seasons, the plants that helped and the ones that did not, and the difference between the two in specific conditions. He became in the years that followed a folk physician of considerable reputation across 3 counties of the Appalachian High Country. He set the broken bones of 2 generations of children in and around Caldwell Hollow. He never charged a family that could not pay. He named his first daughter Mary after a woman he had never met, but whose Bible he had watched being returned to her daughter's hands on a February morning that he thought about for the rest of his life. He kept his father's folding knife in his pocket every day he lived. Clara returned it to him on the morning of his 18th birthday, and he wept and she did not, because she had used up her supply of public weeping a long time ago, and had found she did not miss it. Cutter Drake's son Eli recovered fully. He grew up in the high country north of Caldwell Hollow and became a capable man who was known among his neighbors for the specific quality of his fairness. The kind of fairness that comes to people who know what it means to be on the wrong side of a closed door and have been shown a different way. He named his second child Clara after a woman he had no memory of, but whose name his father repeated to him whenever the subject of debts came up, saying, "Some debts you can repay, and some debts you can only carry correctly. This is one you carry correctly." Solomon Reed died in the winter of 1882. He was 75 years old, and he went the way he had lived, which is to say, quietly and on his own terms and in a place he had chosen. He was sitting in a chair on the small porch of the cabin that Clara and Grace had built for him, a quarter-mile from the cave in the summer of 1879, when his eyes had begun failing enough that they had both decided without making it a conversation he had to lose that he should be close enough to hear if they called. Captain was at his feet. The first crocuses of the year were coming up yellow through the last of the snow at the base of the porch steps. He had been watching a pair of cardinals in the dogwood across the path. The male was very red against the gray late winter sky. He was watching the bird when he stopped watching it. They buried him on the ridge above the cave beside a white oak whose acorn crop had fed a generation of deer in the surrounding country. Clara cut the headstone herself from a flat piece of sandstone she had been setting aside for a year, because she had known for a year that the year was coming. She cut into it. Solomon Reed, 1807 to 1882. He was the second man to keep his promise. Captain refused to leave the grave for the first week. The sisters carried food and water up to him every morning. On the 8th day he came down the hill on his own and lay on the warm stones of the cave hearth, and ate and slept, and allowed himself to be loved for 2 more years before he followed his man. Rowena Hale became the dearest friend the Ashwood sisters ever had. Her son, James Jr., grew up and became an engineer on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad line and named his first son Eli, after a man he had met 3 times as a small child and had never forgotten. Her daughter Beth became a school teacher in the Hollow and taught the alphabet to a generation of children using a small leather-bound Bible whose spine had been replaced once and would be replaced again before she was done with it. Warren Pruitt died in the summer of 1885 and left the entire general store in his will to the Caldwell Hollow Foundling Home on the single condition that no child in that home would ever again be turned away or turned out in winter. The condition was written into the deed and has been honored by every subsequent owner of that building in every subsequent decade, without exception. Agnes Holt ran the foundling home until 1885, and in the last years of her tenure, a generation of girls she had raised began gently and without drama to write things down in their own small books. She did not stop them. She did not comment on it, except once. A girl of about 13 was crouching at the bank of the creek behind the home after a summer thunderstorm, marking the water level on a smooth gray stone, the way she had seen done without knowing quite where the practice came from. Agnes walked up behind her and stood there. Then she said, "Mark the stone child. The stick will rot." She walked back to the house. The girl, who had been bracing for a reprimand, did not know what to do with what had happened. She told the story for the rest of her life. Agnes Holt was buried in 1890 beside her mother Eleanor in the small cemetery of the Massachusetts town that no longer appears on any map. Her headstone by her own written instruction reads, Agnes Holt. She understood at last. Reverend Voss stayed at the church until 1888. He preached in those years a quieter gospel than the one he had carried down from Philadelphia, and he learned the names of the men in his congregation who had worn each color and visited the sick on both sides of the aisle without comment on the difference. He came to the cave once each autumn in October, when the trail was still clear and the apple tree in his yard had given its fruit, and he brought a sack of late apples and stayed for tea, and did not stay long. He never asked for forgiveness in words. The sisters never offered it in words. The apples came every year until the year he died. Clara and Grace Ashwood did not return to Caldwell Hollow. The cave was their home for 54 more years. They expanded it. They built proper wooden rooms within the limestone shell framed in chestnut and floored with split oak. They built a long, low porch across the face of the hill, where the morning sun came in summer. They kept goats whose bells they could hear from the porch on still mornings. They kept eventually 307 books. The largest private library in the western part of the county, arranged on shelves Solomon had helped them build, before his eyes began to fail. They never married. They had been asked. They thanked the men and declined not unkindly because they had examined their lives and found them complete in a way that did not require addition. Women came up from the hollow and from other hollows across the years to learn from them how to read the sky, how to preserve what the earth gives in the months it gives it, how to deliver a child when the doctor is 2 days away, how to set a broken arm, how to grow lettuce in the warm, dark earth of a cave in the middle of winter. They taught what they knew, the way their father had taught them, not as doctrine, but as observation, not as truth delivered from above, but as pattern recognized from below, from the creek bank and the ledger page and the careful mark cut into the gray stone. The ledger they kept eventually ceased to be a record of the weather. It became a record of the lives they had touched, the seeds given away, the families fed, the children born in the back room of the cave when the weather closed the road, the names of the women who had come up the mountain not knowing what they were looking for and had gone back down knowing. They died as they had lived, which is to say, together and in the place they had built, and without making more of it than it was. It was a mild afternoon in the autumn of 1927. The wood thrushes had been late leaving that year, which Grace had noted in the ledger 3 days before, and Clara had confirmed the following morning. and they had been discussing it in the comfortable way of two people who have been having the same conversation for 70 years and have not yet exhausted it. Grace was in the cane chair on the porch with a cup of mullein tea cooling in her lap. Clara was beside her with a small basket of saved bean seeds, sorting them by hand, the ones that would hold through the winter from the ones that would not. From inside the cave came the sound of a young woman chopping vegetables for the evening meal. Her name was Lila Fenn. She was Tobias Fenn's youngest granddaughter. She had come to the cave at 16 to learn what the sisters knew, and had stayed and come back and stayed again, and had settled into the life of the place the way water settles into a hollow in stone, filling it completely, and without apparent effort. Grace, said Clara. Clara said yes. Grace did not say anything else. She closed her eyes in the way of a person settling into a chair. She knows very well with the ease of something that has been waiting patiently for exactly this. And she did not open them again. Clara sat beside her sister on the porch until the sun went behind the western ridge, and the mountain's shadow came up across the boards, and the goat bells rang in the pasture below. Then she went inside and told Lila what had happened, and her voice was steady because she had known for a while that this was coming, and she had made her peace with the shape of it. They buried Grace 2 days later on the ridge above the cave, beside Solomon Reed and the white oak in the ground that her father's hands had first touched, and her own hands had helped to tend for 54 years. Clara followed her sister 6 days afterward. She had gone to bed on the Thursday, and she had not risen on the Friday morning. Lila Fenn found her with the bronze medal in her right hand, and her mother's Bible open on the quilt beside her open. To no particular page open the way a book is open, when the person reading it has been reading until the exact moment they were no longer reading anything at all. Her face was quiet. Her face was at peace. Her face was the face of a woman who has finished what she came to do and knows it. They were buried under a single flat stone on the ridge above the cave. The stone reads by their own instruction left in the ledger 10 years earlier in Clara's handwriting, Clara and Grace Ashwood, 1856 to 1927. They saw the winter coming. The cave is still there. The geothermal spring still flows at the back of it. The fissure in the ceiling still draws smoke straight. The warm earth still grows things in February that have no business growing in February. And the women who come to learn at the farm school that Lila Fenn built across the face of the hill still plant by candlelight in November, and still write down what they see, not what they are told what they see. If you drive west from Charlottesville in the fall past the point where the county road leaves the river and begins to climb into the hard woods, and you stop at the right place and ask the right person, someone will tell you how to find the old Ashwood place. They will tell you about the porch. They will tell you about the spring. They may, if they know you well enough, tell you about the stone on the ridge. They will all say the same thing when they finish telling you. They will say she was right, you know, about the winter. She was right about all of it. Now listen, you have a key. You may not know you have it. It may have been sitting in a drawer for years, an inheritance from someone who loved you in ways you did not fully understand while they were alive to be understood. It may feel useless. It may feel like the key to a hole in the ground that no one else wanted on a piece of land. No one else valued in a world that told you to your face that what you had was not worth keeping. The world was wrong. The world has always been wrong about this particular thing. What your father left you, what your mother left you, what the person who loved you most carefully and with the most foresight left. You was not worthless because no one else wanted it. It was waiting. It has been waiting in the cold for you to be ready to walk toward it. 2 days, maybe. 3. In weather that does not care how tired you are or how long you have been walking, or whether you believe the road will end somewhere worth ending. There will be a wolf on the trail. There will be a night when the bread goes bad, and someone says we could go back. There will be a door in the dark that someone is hitting from the wrong side. Walk past the wolf. Open the book. Hold the door. The kingdom is at the end of the road, and it has a warm spring at its back, and a draw in its ceiling and earth that will grow what you plant in it, if you have the courage to plant it underground. In November, when every voice you know is telling you to stop, walk west. Keep going. Use the key.